Marcus Williams walked through the hospital corridors with the same quiet determination he had carried for 15 years. At 42, his graying hair and gentle eyes made him look more like a college professor than someone who had seen the worst humanity could offer. He wore simple scrubs, carried a worn medical bag, and moved with the unhurried pace of someone who knew that healing took time. The other staff barely noticed him. To them, Marcus was just another medic who worked the night shift, someone who kept to himself and never talked about his past. He preferred it that way. The silence meant he didn't have to explain the nightmares that still woke him at 3 a.m, or why he sometimes flinched when helicopters flew overhead. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Marcus was checking supplies in the emergency room when the ambulances began arriving. A massive car accident on the interstate had created chaos. Multiple vehicles were involved, and the injured were pouring in faster than the hospital could handle them. "We need all hands," Dr. Sarah Chen announced over the intercom. "This is going to be a long night." Marcus immediately sprang into action. While the doctors and nurses rushed around and controlled panic, he moved with a different kind of precision. His hands were steady as he assessed injuries, his voice calm as he spoke to frightened patients. There was something about the way he worked that caught people's attention, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. The first patient was a young mother with severe internal bleeding. The doctors were struggling to stabilize her when Marcus stepped forward. "May I?" he asked quietly. Without waiting for an answer, he began applying pressure in a specific way that seemed to stop the bleeding almost immediately. The trauma surgeon looked surprised but grateful. "Where did you learn that technique?" Dr. Chen asked during a brief moment between patients. Marcus just smiled and moved on to the next case. He never talked about his training, never mentioned where he had learned the skills that seemed far beyond what a regular medic should possess. His colleagues had long ago stopped asking about his background. He was helpful, reliable, and skilled, and that was enough for them. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself working on increasingly difficult cases. A teenager with multiple fractures, an elderly man in cardiac arrest, a construction worker with severe burns. Each time he approached the situation with the same quiet competence. His hands seemed to know exactly what to do, and his presence had a calming effect on both patients and staff. Around midnight, they brought in a case that made even the experienced emergency room staff pause. A young soldier on leave had been caught in the accident. His injuries were severe, and he was conscious but in tremendous pain. The soldier's eyes were wild with fear and trauma, and he was fighting against anyone who tried to help him. "He's having a panic attack on top of everything else," one of the nurses said. "We can't get close enough to treat him properly." The doctors tried sedatives, tried talking to him, but nothing worked. The young man kept thrashing, reopening his wounds and making his condition worse. The medical team was at a loss when Marcus quietly approached the bed. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked in a voice that carried something the others didn't have. It was the voice of someone who had been where this soldier was, who understood the darkness behind his eyes. "Rodriguez," the soldier managed to gasp. "Private First Class Rodriguez." Marcus knelt beside the bed, positioning himself where Rodriguez could see him clearly. "Listen to me, Rodriguez. You're safe now. The fighting is over. You're in a hospital and we're going to take care of you." Something in Marcus's tone seemed to reach through the soldier's panic. His breathing began to slow slightly, though his eyes remained frightened. "I know what you're seeing," Marcus continued softly. "I know the sounds you're hearing that aren't really there. But you're not there anymore. You're here, and you're going to be okay." The medical staff watched in amazement as Rodriguez gradually calmed down. Marcus continued talking, his words carrying a weight of understanding that came from experience, not training. Slowly, the soldier allowed the team to work on his injuries. "How did you do that?" Dr. Chen asked later, after Rodriguez had been stabilized and moved to surgery. Marcus was cleaning his hands at the sink, his movements methodical and precise. "Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone," he said simply. But Dr. Chen noticed something else. When Marcus had rolled up his sleeves to work on Rodriguez, she had caught a glimpse of scarring on his forearms. Not the kind of scars that came from accidents or medical procedures, but the kind that told a different story entirely. The kind that came from combat. The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity. Marcus continued working with the same quiet efficiency, never drawing attention to himself, never asking for recognition. By dawn, the emergency room had finally settled down. The last of the accident victims had been treated and moved to appropriate departments. As Marcus was preparing to leave for the day, Dr. Chen approached him. "Marcus, I've been wondering about something. Your technique tonight, the way you handled Rodriguez, your medical skills in general, they seem more advanced than what we'd expect from someone with your official training." Marcus paused in packing his bag. For a moment something flickered across his face, a shadow of memories he kept carefully locked away. "I've had some experience with trauma cases," he said finally. "What kind of experience?" But Marcus had already turned away, walking toward the exit with that same quiet stride. "See you tomorrow night, Dr. Chen," he called over his shoulder. As she watched him go, Dr. Chen realized that Marcus Williams was far more than he appeared to be. The way he had moved during the crisis, the techniques he had used, the understanding in his voice when he spoke to Rodriguez, none of it came from civilian medical training. She made a mental note to look into his personnel file more carefully. Something told her that the quiet medic who worked the night shift had a story worth knowing, even if he wasn't ready to tell it yet. Outside, Marcus walked to his old pickup truck as the sun rose over the city. Another night was over, another shift where he had been able to help people without having to explain who he really was or where he had learned to save lives under the worst possible conditions. He preferred the anonymity, the ability to serve without recognition or questions. But sometimes, like tonight when he had looked into Rodriguez's terrified eyes, the past felt very close. Sometimes the memories of distant battlefields and fallen comrades pressed against the careful walls he had built around them. Tonight had been one of those nights when being just a medic felt both like a blessing and a burden he carried alone. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the hospital. Admiral Rebecca Torres of the United States Navy rarely made unannounced visits to civilian medical facilities, but Private Rodriguez was under her command, and she made it a point to personally check on any of her sailors who were injured while on leave. Admiral Torres was a woman who commanded respect through presence alone. At 55, she had earned her position through 3 decades of exemplary service, including 2 combat deployments and a Bronze Star for valor. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her bearing spoke of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She arrived at the hospital just as the morning shift was taking over from the night crew. Her aide, Lieutenant Commander James Park, accompanied her as she made her way to the surgical ward where Rodriguez was recovering. "The private is in stable condition," Dr. Chen explained as she led them through the corridors. "The surgery went well and he should make a full recovery. But I have to tell you, Admiral, without the intervention of one of our night medics, things could have gone very differently." Admiral Torres raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Dr. Chen described the events of the previous night, explaining how Rodriguez had been in a state of severe panic that was preventing treatment. "Our medic, Marcus Williams, was able to calm him down in a way that our usual protocols couldn't. He seemed to understand exactly what the young man was going through." "I'd like to meet this medic," Admiral Torres said. "Is he available?" "He works nights, so he's probably headed home by now. But I can call him if you'd like." 20 minutes later, Marcus walked back into the hospital, having received Dr. Chen's urgent call just as he was settling down for his morning coffee. He had thrown on jeans and a worn flannel shirt, looking more like a construction worker than someone who had just spent 12 hours saving lives. When he entered the conference room where Admiral Torres was waiting, he stopped short. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure flickered. Then he straightened slightly and extended his hand. "Admiral Torres, I presume. Dr. Chen said you wanted to speak with me about Private Rodriguez." The Admiral shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the way he made direct eye contact. There was something familiar about his bearing, something that triggered her military instincts. "Mr. Williams, Dr. Chen tells me you were instrumental in helping Rodriguez last night. I wanted to thank you personally." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I just did my job, ma'am. Any medic would have done the same." "I don't think so," Admiral Torres said, studying his face carefully. "Dr. Chen described your approach as unusually effective. She said you seemed to understand what Rodriguez was experiencing in a way that suggested personal familiarity with combat trauma." The room fell silent. Marcus looked down at his hands, then back up at the Admiral. "Sometimes life gives you experiences that help you help others," he said carefully. Admiral Torres nodded slowly. There was definitely something about this man that felt familiar, something beyond his obvious competence and compassion. She had served long enough to recognize certain qualities in people, and Marcus Williams possessed them in abundance. "Would you be willing to visit Rodriguez?" she asked. "He's been asking about the medic who helped him last night. I think it would mean a lot to him." Marcus agreed, and they made their way to the surgical ward. Rodriguez was awake and alert, though clearly still in pain. His face lit up when he saw Marcus enter the room. "You're the one who helped me," Rodriguez said, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. "I don't remember much about last night, but I remember your voice. You kept me from losing it completely." Marcus pulled up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling today, son?" "Better. The doctors say I'll be fine thanks to you and the team here." Rodriguez paused, then looked directly at Marcus. "Sir, can I ask you something? Last night when you were talking to me, you said things that made me think you'd been in combat. Were you military?" Admiral Torres, standing at the foot of the bed, watched Marcus's reaction carefully. She saw him consider his words, saw the internal struggle between the privacy he had maintained for years and the honest question from a young soldier who had been helped in his darkest moment. "I served," Marcus said finally. "A long time ago. What branch?" Rodriguez asked. Marcus hesitated again. "Navy. I was a hospital corpsman." Admiral Torres felt something click into place. Hospital corpsmen, the Navy's medics, the ones who served with Marines in combat zones. She had worked with hundreds of them over her career, and she knew the special kind of courage and skill they possessed. "What unit?" she found herself asking, though she hadn't intended to speak. Marcus looked at her for a long moment before answering. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2014. The Admiral's eyes widened slightly. She knew that unit, knew their reputation, and knew the kind of fighting they had seen during those years. The 3-7 Marines had been involved in some of the heaviest combat of the war, and their corpsmen had earned a reputation for extraordinary heroism under fire. "Doc Williams," Rodriguez said suddenly, using the traditional Marine nickname for Navy corpsmen. "That's what they called you, wasn't it? That's why you knew how to help me last night." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile Admiral Torres had seen from him. "Yeah, kid. That's what they called me." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Rodriguez asking questions about Marcus's service and Marcus answering with careful brevity. Admiral Torres listened, noting the respect in Rodriguez's voice and the way Marcus seemed to shed years when talking to the young soldier. When they finally left Rodriguez's room, Admiral Torres asked Marcus to walk with her to a quiet area of the hospital. Lieutenant Commander Park tactfully remained behind, understanding that his presence was not needed for this conversation. "Mr. Williams," the Admiral began, "I've been in the Navy for 30 years and I've worked with a lot of corpsmen. Your service record must be quite something for you to have the skills and understanding you demonstrated last night." Marcus looked out the window at the city skyline, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was unmistakably military, despite his civilian clothes. "Some records are better left alone, Admiral," he said quietly, but Admiral Torres wasn't ready to let it go. Something about Marcus Williams nagged at her, something beyond even his obvious qualifications and experience. She had an excellent memory for names and faces, especially when it came to decorated service members, and the name Williams connected to the 3-7 Marines was triggering a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "Would you mind if I asked what you did after your service?" she inquired. "I came here, got my civilian medical certification and started working as a paramedic, then moved to hospital work. I've been here about 10 years now. And before that? After you left the Marines, but before you came here?" Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I took some time to readjust. It's not always easy transitioning back to civilian life." Admiral Torres understood. She had seen too many good people struggle with that transition, seen careers and lives derailed by the invisible wounds of war, but she also sensed there was more to Marcus's story than a simple adjustment period. As they prepared to part ways, she made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Williams, I'm going to be in town for a few more days checking on Rodriguez and handling some other business. Would you be willing to have coffee with me tomorrow? I'd like to learn more about your work here and maybe discuss some opportunities." Marcus looked surprised. "Opportunities? The Navy is always looking for experienced medical personnel, especially those with your background. There might be ways you could serve again, either as a reservist or in a civilian capacity." For just a moment, Admiral Torres saw something in Marcus's eyes that looked like longing, like a part of him wanted nothing more than to return to the service he had clearly loved. But then the shutters came down again and he was once more the quiet, unassuming hospital medic. "I'll think about it," he said. "Thank you for the offer, Admiral." As Marcus walked away, Admiral Torres made a mental note to do some research. Something about Marcus Williams didn't add up, and her instincts told her there was much more to his story than he was willing to share. The name was familiar, connected to something significant, and she was determined to figure out what it was. That evening, she would make some calls to old contacts, dig into service records, and try to solve the puzzle of the medic who seemed far more than he appeared to be. Admiral Torres spent that evening in her hotel room, laptop open on the desk before her, searching through military databases and service records. The name Marcus Williams had been bothering her all day, nagging at the edge of her memory like a half-remembered song. She knew she had heard it before, in a context that was important, but the details remained frustratingly elusive. She started with the basic service records for hospital corpsmen who had served with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines during the time frame Marcus had mentioned. The list was longer than she expected, and many of the names were familiar to her from commendation, reports and casualty lists she had reviewed over the years. Then she found Cadet Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Marcus J. Williams, service, dates 2008-2015, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, and attached to his record was a citation that made Admiral Torres sit back in her chair and stare at the Navy Cross, the 2nd highest decoration for valor in the United States military. She clicked on the detailed citation, and as she read, the memories came flooding back. She remembered this case now, remembered the briefings, remembered the discussions at the Pentagon about whether the actions described warranted the Medal of Honor itself. The citation was dated September 15, 2013. Marcus Williams had been serving as the senior corpsman for Charlie Company during Operation Enduring Freedom. His unit had been conducting a patrol in the Helmand province when they were ambushed by a superior force of Taliban fighters. The attack had been coordinated and devastating, leaving multiple Marines wounded and trapped in an open area with limited cover. According to the official report, Corpsman Williams had exposed himself to heavy enemy fire repeatedly to reach wounded Marines. Over the course of a 4-hour firefight, he had treated and evacuated 12 seriously wounded men, many of them under direct fire. When the unit's radio operator was killed, Williams had taken over communications, coordinating air support while continuing to treat casualties. But the most remarkable part of the story came near the end of the engagement. A mortar round had exploded near a group of wounded Marines who were waiting for evacuation, seriously injuring Williams himself and leaving him with shrapnel wounds to his arms and torso. Despite his own injuries, he had continued working, ultimately carrying a wounded sergeant over 200 meters through enemy fire to reach the extraction point. The citation concluded with a line that gave Admiral Torres chills. Hospital Corpsman Williams's extraordinary heroism, unwavering dedication to his fellow Marines, and complete disregard for his own safety in the face of overwhelming enemy fire reflect great credit upon himself and uphold the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Admiral Torres leaned back in her chair, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The scars Dr. Chen had mentioned seeing on Marcus's arms, those weren't from accidents or medical procedures. They were from shrapnel, from that day in Afghanistan when he had saved 12 Marines and nearly died doing it. She continued reading, looking for more details about Marcus's service after the medal ceremony. What she found surprised her. Instead of the career advancement that typically followed such recognition, Marcus's record showed a steady decline. He had completed his enlistment, but had turned down opportunities for promotion and additional training. His final fitness reports, while still positive, noted that he had become withdrawn and preferred to work alone. The file included a psychological evaluation from 2014 that mentioned symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, though Marcus had apparently been reluctant to engage with treatment. His final entry showed an honorable discharge in 2015, with a note that he had declined all re-enlistment, bonuses, and opportunities. Admiral Torres spent the next hour reading everything she could find about Marcus Williams and the engagement that had earned him the Navy Cross. She found news articles from the time, interviews with other Marines who had served with him, and reports from commanders who had recommended him for the medal. One quote stood out to her. From Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, no relation, who had been Marcus's commanding officer. Doc Williams was the kind of corpsman you read about in history books. The Marines trusted him completely because they knew he would never leave them behind, no matter what. That day in Helmand he proved it, but I think saving all those men cost him something inside. After we got back he was different. Still the best corpsman I ever served with, but different. Now Admiral Torres understood why Marcus had seemed so familiar, why his bearing and competence had triggered her military instincts. She had been right to sense that he was much more than he appeared. Marcus Williams wasn't just a former Navy corpsman. He was a genuine war hero, a man who had earned one of the nation's highest honors for valor. The question was why he was hiding it. She thought about their conversation at the hospital, about the careful way he had answered questions about his service. He had told the truth, but only the bare minimum. No mention of the Navy Cross, no hint of the extraordinary things he had done in combat. Admiral Torres had seen this before. Some of the best people she had served with were the ones who never talked about their achievements, who carried their honors quietly and focused on the work rather than the recognition. But there was something else going on with Marcus Williams, something deeper than simple modesty. She pulled up his medical records from his final year of service. The PTSD evaluation mentioned sleep disturbances, survivor's guilt, and a persistent belief that he could have done more to save the Marines who had died in other engagements. The psychologist had noted that Marcus seemed to feel responsible for every casualty his unit had suffered, despite the fact that his actions had saved far more lives than were lost. Classic survivor's guilt, the report concluded. Subject exhibits high levels of anxiety when discussing combat experiences, and tends to minimize his own contributions while magnifying perceived failures. Recommend continued therapy and close monitoring. But according to the records, Marcus had attended only 2 therapy sessions before declining further treatment. His discharge paperwork showed that he had left the military with full honors, but without addressing the psychological wounds that were clearly affecting him. Admiral Torres closed the laptop and sat in the dark hotel room, thinking about the quiet man she had met that day. Marcus Williams had saved a dozen Marines in a single engagement, earning the Navy Cross in the process. He had continued serving his country with distinction for 2 more years after that. And now he was working night shifts at a civilian hospital, using his extraordinary skills to help people while hiding his past from everyone around him. She thought about Dr. Chen's description of how Marcus had handled Private Rodriguez, how he had understood exactly what the young soldier was experiencing. Of course he had understood. Marcus Williams knew better than most what it meant to carry invisible wounds, to struggle with memories that wouldn't fade. The Admiral made a decision that night. She was going to keep her coffee appointment with Marcus Williams, but not to discuss opportunities for future service. She was going to try to understand why a genuine war hero was hiding, his identity, and whether there was anything she could do to help him find his way back to the man he had been before the war had taken its toll. She also made another decision. She was going to make sure that the people at the hospital knew exactly who they had been working alongside all these years. Marcus Williams deserved recognition for his current service, but more than that, he deserved to know that his past service was still honored and remembered. As she prepared for bed, Admiral Torres couldn't stop thinking about the citation she had read. Complete disregard for his own safety in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. That was the Marcus Williams who had saved 12 Marines in Afghanistan. Somewhere inside the quiet hospital medic was still that same man, still serving others, still putting their needs before his own. Tomorrow, she would try to help him remember that being a hero wasn't something to hide from, but something to carry with pride. Outside her hotel window, the city slept peacefully, protected by people like Marcus Williams who had sacrificed so much to keep others safe. Admiral Torres fell asleep thinking about the responsibility they all shared to take care of those who had taken care of others, especially when they wouldn't take care of themselves. The coffee shop Marcus had chosen was a small, quiet place near the hospital that served the night shift workers and early morning commuters. Admiral Torres arrived first, selecting a corner table where they could speak privately. She had dressed in civilian clothes for this meeting, understanding instinctively that Marcus might be more comfortable without the formal reminder of military hierarchy. Marcus walked in exactly on time, looking tired but alert. He had clearly just finished his night shift, and Admiral Torres could see the weariness in his movements that came from 12 hours of demanding work. He spotted her immediately and approached the table with that same careful reserve she had noticed the day before. "Admiral Torres," he said, extending his hand as he sat down. "Thank you for asking me to meet with you." "Please call me Rebecca," she said, noting how his eyes showed surprise at the informality. "And thank you for coming. I know you must be exhausted." They ordered coffee and sat in silence for a moment, each taking the measure of the other. Admiral Torres could see Marcus evaluating her, trying to understand why a senior military officer wanted to have coffee with a hospital medic. She could also see the wariness in his expression, the same caution she had noticed when he talked about his military service. "Marcus," she began carefully, "I did some research last night after our conversation at the hospital." She watched his face change, saw the walls go up and the shutters close over his eyes. He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "What kind of research?" he asked, his voice neutral but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "The kind that reminded me why your name was familiar." Admiral Torres kept her voice gentle but direct. "Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Marcus J. Williams, Navy Cross recipient. September 15, 2013, Helmand Province, Afghanistan." Marcus was very still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled. "I see. And what would you like to know, Admiral?" "I'd like to know why a war hero is working night shifts at a civilian hospital and telling people he's just a medic." Marcus looked out the window at the morning traffic, his jaw working as he considered his response. When he turned back to her, there was something in his eyes that looked like pain mixed with resignation. "Because that's all I am now," he said simply. "The man who earned that medal died in Afghanistan. I'm just someone who's trying to make up for all the Marines I couldn't save." Admiral Torres felt her heart clench at the raw honesty in his voice. She had suspected survivor's guilt, but hearing it stated so plainly was devastating. "Marcus," she said softly, "you saved 12 men that day. 12 Marines went home to their families because of what you did." "And how many didn't?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many boys did I watch die because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't good enough, wasn't there when they needed me?" The coffee shop seemed to fade away around them as Marcus continued, the words coming out like water through a broken dam. "Do you know what it's like to hold pressure on a 19-year-old's chest wound while he tells you about his girlfriend back home? And then watch him die anyway? Do you know what it's like to promise someone's mother that you'll bring her son home safe, and then have to write a letter explaining why you couldn't keep that promise?" Admiral Torres listened without interrupting, recognizing that this was probably the first time Marcus had spoken these truths aloud in years. The pain in his voice was real and deep, the kind of wound that didn't heal with time alone. "After that day in Helmand," Marcus continued, "everyone wanted to shake my hand, tell me I was a hero, pin medals on my chest, but all I could think about was the Marines who didn't make it to the extraction point. All I could see were the faces of the boys I'd lost in previous engagements. The medal felt like a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Admiral Torres said firmly. "What you did that day was extraordinary. You saved lives under impossible conditions." Marcus shook his head. "I did my job. Nothing more, nothing less. And when I couldn't do it anymore, when the nightmares and the guilt became too much, I ran away. I left the Corps, left the military, and tried to disappear." "But you didn't disappear," Admiral Torres observed. "You became a paramedic, then a hospital medic. You kept serving, kept saving lives. It's not the same thing, isn't it? Dr. Chen told me what you did for Private Rodriguez 2 nights ago. You used the same skills, the same compassion, the same courage that earned you the Navy Cross. The only difference is the uniform." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been asking himself for years. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked finally. "Why does a Navy admiral care about one burned-out former corpsman?" Admiral Torres considered her answer carefully. "Because I've been in the military for 30 years and I've learned to recognize certain qualities in people. Courage, dedication, the willingness to put others before yourself. These things don't disappear just because someone changes careers. And because the military failed you," Marcus looked up sharply, "the military didn't fail me. I failed it." "No," Admiral Torres said firmly. The military failed you by not recognizing that earning a medal for valor doesn't make someone immune to psychological wounds. We failed you by expecting you to carry the weight of every loss without giving you the tools to process that weight. We failed you by letting you leave without making sure you understood that survivor's guilt is not the same thing as personal failure. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Admiral Torres's voice seemed to reach him. I've seen this before, she continued. Some of our best people, our most dedicated service members, are the ones who suffer most when they can't save everyone. They hold themselves to impossible standards and then destroy themselves when they can't meet them. So what are you suggesting? Marcus asked. That I should forget about the Marines who died? That I should pretend their deaths don't matter? I'm suggesting that you honor their memory by recognizing that your life has value too. Those Marines didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. They died protecting something they believed in. And part of what they were protecting was the right of people like you to live full, meaningful lives. Marcus was quiet again, processing her words. Admiral Torres could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the battle between the guilt he had carried for so long and the possibility of something different. The work you're doing at the hospital, she said gently, it's not less valuable than what you did in Afghanistan. It's a continuation of the same mission, serving others, saving lives, making a difference. The young man you helped 2 nights ago is alive and healing because of your skills and your compassion. How is that different from what you did in Helmand? It's not under fire, Marcus said quietly. No, but it's still courage. It still takes someone special to work night shifts in an emergency room, to face trauma and suffering every day, to be the steady hand that guides people through their worst moments. You're still that Marine who earned the Navy Cross, Marcus. You're still serving your country and your fellow human beings. You just do it in scrubs instead of camouflage. For the first time since they had started talking, Marcus smiled slightly. It was a small tentative expression, but it was genuine. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. Admiral Torres reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Maybe it's time you did. Maybe it's time you stopped running from who you are and started embracing the fact that heroes come in many forms. The Marcus Williams who saved 12 Marines is the same Marcus Williams who saved Private Rodriguez. The only difference is that now you have the wisdom that comes from experience, including the experience of loss. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Admiral Torres spoke again. I have a proposition for you, she said. But before I make it, I want you to promise me something. Marcus looked at her curiously. Promise me you'll stop referring to yourself as just a medic. You're a Navy Cross recipient who happens to work as a medic. There's a significant difference. Marcus stared at Admiral Torres for a long moment, weighing her words. The idea of acknowledging his military achievements felt foreign after so many years of deliberate anonymity. But something in her direct, compassionate approach was breaking through the walls he had built around his past. What kind of proposition? He asked carefully. Admiral Torres leaned forward slightly. The Navy is developing a new program for veteran healthcare, specifically focused on helping former service members transition back to civilian life while dealing with combat-related trauma. We need someone to help design and implement the program, someone who understands both the medical aspects and the psychological challenges. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The idea of returning to military service, even in a civilian capacity, brought back a flood of emotions he had spent years trying to suppress. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, he said. I couldn't even handle my own transition successfully. That's exactly why you're the right person, Admiral Torres replied. You understand what doesn't work because you've lived it. You know what these veterans need because you needed it yourself, and you've proven that you can continue serving effectively even while carrying your own wounds. She pulled out a folder she had been carrying and placed it on the table between them. This is preliminary information about the program. It would be based here in the city, working with the VA hospital but also partnering with civilian facilities like the one where you work now. You'd be developing protocols, training staff, and working directly with veterans who are struggling with the same issues you've faced. Marcus opened the folder and began reading. The program description talked about holistic approaches to veteran care, addressing not just physical injuries, but the psychological and social challenges of reintegration. It emphasized peer support, mentorship, and the importance of having treatment providers who understood military culture and combat experience firsthand. This looks comprehensive, Marcus said, though his voice carried uncertainty. But I'm not a psychologist or a program administrator. I'm just... He caught himself before saying, just a medic, and saw Admiral Torres smile slightly. You're a decorated combat veteran with 15 years of medical experience. Both military and civilian, she corrected. You've worked with trauma patients in the most extreme conditions possible, and you've navigated your own recovery journey. That combination of experience is exactly what this program needs. Marcus continued reading, noting sections about training civilian medical staff to work with veterans, establishing support networks for former service members, and creating bridges between military and civilian healthcare systems. The more he read, the more he could see the potential impact of such a program. There's something else, Admiral Torres said. Private Rodriguez isn't the only veteran you've helped at the hospital. I did some checking with Dr. Chen this morning. She told me about at least 6 other former service members you've treated over the past 2 years. In each case, you seem to have an unusual ability to connect with them and help them through medical crises. Marcus looked surprised. He hadn't realized that anyone had been paying attention to those interactions. In his mind, he had simply been doing his job, responding to patients who reminded him of the Marines he had served with. Dr. Chen also mentioned that several of those veterans came back to the hospital specifically to thank you. Admiral Torres continued. One of them, a former Army sergeant named Johnson, told her that talking to you during his treatment had convinced him to finally seek help for his PTSD. He's been in therapy for 8 months now and is doing much better. The information hit Marcus harder than he expected. He remembered Sergeant Johnson, a gruff former infantry soldier who had been brought in after a motorcycle accident. During his treatment, Johnson had mentioned nightmares and panic attacks, and Marcus had shared some basic information about veteran resources. He hadn't thought much about it afterward. You see, Admiral Torres said gently, you've already been doing this work. You've been helping veterans transition and heal, one person at a time. This program would just give you the resources and support to do it more effectively and on a larger scale. Marcus closed the folder and looked out the window again. The morning rush hour was in full swing, people hurrying to jobs and responsibilities, most of them probably unaware of the veterans among them who might be struggling with invisible wounds. I'd have to think about it, he said finally. This would mean stepping back into a world I've been trying to leave behind for 10 years. It would mean stepping forward into a new way of serving, Admiral Torres replied. You don't have to relive your combat experience to help other veterans. You just have to be willing to use what you learned from it. They sat in silence for a few minutes, both understanding that this was a decision that couldn't be rushed. Finally, Marcus spoke. Can I ask you something, Admiral? Why are you really doing this? Why does my particular story matter to you? Admiral Torres considered the question carefully. Because 15 years ago, I lost someone very important to me. My younger brother, Captain David Torres, Marine Corps. He was killed by an IED in Iraq in 2010. Marcus felt the familiar weight of shared loss settle over the conversation. David was a lot like you, she continued. Dedicated, selfless, always putting his Marines first. After he died, I started paying more attention to the men and women who served under commanders like him. I saw too many good people leave the military broken and lost, unable to find their way back to the lives they had sacrificed so much to protect. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I read your service record last night, when I saw what you had accomplished and then learned how you had essentially disappeared from military life, it reminded me of David's Marines. Good people who had given everything and then felt forgotten by the very institution they had served so faithfully. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the deeper motivation behind Admiral Torres's interest in his story. This program, she said, it's partly about helping veterans like you, but it's also about honoring the memory of people like my brother by making sure their sacrifice continues to have meaning. David died protecting his Marines. You lived through your experiences for a reason, Marcus. Maybe that reason is to help others find their way home. The words resonated with something deep inside Marcus, something he had buried under years of guilt and self-doubt. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of the sense of purpose that had once driven him to serve. If I were to consider this, he said slowly, what would the timeline look like? Admiral Torres pulled out her phone and checked her calendar. The program is still in development. We'd need someone to come on board within the next 3 months to help with the final planning and implementation. There would be training, both for you and for the staff you'd be working with. The goal is to have the program operational within a year. Marcus thought about his current life, about the routine he had built around his night shifts and his careful anonymity. The idea of changing all of that was both terrifying and oddly exciting. I'd want to continue working at the hospital, he said, at least part-time. The work there is important to me. That could probably be arranged. In fact, having you maintain connections with civilian healthcare providers would be valuable for the program. Admiral Torres reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. I'm going to be in town for 3 more days. Think about it. Talk to people you trust, do whatever you need to do to make a decision. But Marcus, don't let fear of the past prevent you from embracing a future where you can make a real difference. Marcus took the card and looked at it for a moment. If I say yes, would I be working directly for the Navy again? You'd be a civilian contractor, not active duty. You'd have autonomy to develop the program according to your vision and experience. The Navy would provide resources and support, but you'd be in charge of the day-to-day operations. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Admiral Torres stood and extended her hand. Whatever you decide, Marcus, I want you to know that meeting you has been an honor. The Marines you served with were lucky to have you, and the patients you treat now are lucky to have you. Don't ever forget that. Marcus shook her hand, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he was considering a future that didn't involve hiding from his past, but rather building on it. Thank you, Admiral, he said, for the opportunity and for reminding me that service comes in many forms. As he walked back to his truck, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years. The conversation had forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding, but it had also opened up possibilities he had never considered. For the first time since leaving the military, he was thinking about tomorrow not as something to endure, but as something that might hold new purpose and meaning. The next 3 days passed in a blur of introspection and difficult conversations. Marcus found himself thinking constantly about Admiral Torres's proposition, weighing the possibilities against the fears that had kept him hidden for so long. He had lived in careful routine for 10 years, and the idea of disrupting that routine felt both liberating and terrifying. On his second night back at work, Dr. Chen approached him during a quiet moment in the emergency room. Marcus, can we talk? She asked, her tone suggesting she had something important on her mind. They found a private corner in the break room, and Dr. Chen sat across from him with an expression that was part curiosity, part concern. Admiral Torres came to see me again yesterday, she began. She told me some things about your military service that I had no idea about. A Navy Cross, Marcus? Why didn't you ever mention that? Marcus felt the familiar discomfort that came with discussing his military honors. It wasn't relevant to the job here, he said simply. Not relevant? Dr. Chen's voice rose slightly in disbelief. Marcus, you're a decorated war hero. You saved 12 Marines under fire. How is that not relevant when you're working in emergency medicine? Marcus looked down at his hands, noting the scars that Admiral Torres had clearly mentioned to Dr. Chen. Because that was a different person, in a different life. The man who earned that medal couldn't handle coming home. He fell apart and ran away from everything he cared about. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression softening. The man who earned that medal is the same man who saved Private Rodriguez 3 nights ago. He's the same man who talked Sergeant Johnson through his panic attack last year, and who helped that young veteran with the overdose stay calm during treatment. You haven't stopped being a hero, Marcus. You've just been hiding it. The conversation was interrupted by an ambulance call, but Dr. Chen's words stayed with Marcus throughout the rest of his shift. He found himself thinking about the other veterans he had helped over the years. Cases he had thought of as simply doing his job, but which others had apparently seen as something more significant. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the VA hospital across town and walked through the halls, observing the patients and staff. He saw young veterans with visible injuries struggling to navigate the system, older veterans dealing with chronic conditions related to their service, and family members trying to understand how to help their loved ones. He also saw overworked staff doing their best with limited resources, civilian medical providers who clearly cared, but sometimes seemed uncertain about how to communicate with military patients. There were gaps in the system, places where someone with his background could make a real difference. That evening, Marcus made a phone call he had been avoiding for 3 years. He called his former squad leader, Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, who was now retired and living in North Carolina. Doc Williams, Torres said, his voice warming with genuine pleasure when he recognized Marcus's voice. I was wondering when I'd hear from you again.
How the hell are you?
They talked for over an hour, catching up on the years since they had served together. Torres filled Marcus in on other members of their unit, including several who had struggled with their own transitions back to civilian life. You know, Doc, Torres said toward the end of the call, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Some of the guys from the unit have been having reunions, and your name always comes up. Everyone wants to know how you're doing. How am I doing? Marcus asked. That's what I'd like to know. Last time we talked, you were pretty torn up about leaving the Corps. You blamed yourself for a lot of things that weren't your fault. Marcus found himself opening up to Torres in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. He told him about his work at the hospital, about Admiral Torres's visit, about the proposition to help develop the veteran healthcare program. Sounds like the Navy finally figured out what I knew 10 years ago, Torres said when Marcus finished. You were wasted just being a corpsman, Doc. Don't get me wrong. You were the best damn corpsman I ever worked with. But you had the kind of leadership and insight that could have taken you a lot further. I wasn't ready for leadership then, Marcus said. I'm not sure I'm ready now. Leadership isn't about being ready, Torres replied. It's about being willing to step up when people need you. And from what you're telling me, there are a lot of veterans out there who need someone like you. The conversation with Torres helped clarify something that had been nagging at Marcus for days. He had spent 10 years focused on his own healing, his own transition, his own struggles. But Admiral Torres was offering him a chance to use those experiences to help others facing similar challenges. On his final night shift before Admiral Torres was scheduled to leave town, Marcus made his decision. He was restocking supplies in the emergency room when his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This is Rodriguez. Got your number from Admiral Torres. Wanted to thank you again for helping me. Also wanted you to know that talking to you made me realize I need to get some help with the stuff in my head. Starting therapy next week? Thank you for showing me it's okay to ask for help. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Rodriguez was barely 21, just beginning his military career. The young Marine had his whole life ahead of him, and maybe with the right support, he wouldn't have to spend years struggling the way Marcus had. The next morning, Marcus called Admiral Torres and asked to meet her for breakfast. This time, he chose a restaurant near the Navy base, a place where his decision would feel more official, more real. Admiral Torres arrived in uniform this time, and Marcus felt a familiar stirring of pride when he saw her. Despite everything that had happened, despite his struggles and doubts, he still respected what the uniform represented. Admiral, he said as she sat down, I've made my decision about the program. She looked at him expectantly, and Marcus could see both hope and understanding in her expression. I want to do it, he said simply. I want to help develop the program and work with veterans who are struggling with transition issues. But I have some conditions. Admiral Torres nodded. Let's hear them. First, I want to continue working part-time at the hospital. The work there is important to me, and I think staying connected to civilian healthcare will make me more effective in the veteran program. Agreed. Second, I want to be involved in training civilian medical staff to work with veterans. A lot of the problems I've seen come from miscommunication and misunderstanding between military, patients, and civilian providers. That's actually something we hoped you'd be interested in. Marcus took a deep breath before stating his final condition. Third, I want the program to include a component for family members. Spouses, children, parents. They're dealing with their own form of trauma when their veteran comes home changed. They need support too, Admiral Torres smiled. That's an excellent idea, and one that shows exactly why you're the right person for this job. They spent the next hour discussing details, timelines, and logistics. Marcus would finish out his current commitments at the hospital, then begin transitioning to the new program over the following 3 months. There would be training both for him and with him, as he helped design protocols and procedures. As they prepared to part ways, Admiral Torres stood and extended her hand once more. But instead of shaking it, Marcus came to attention and saluted. It's been an honor serving with you. Admiral, he said. Admiral Torres returned the salute, her eyes bright with something that looked like pride. The honor has been mine, Marcus. Welcome back to service. As Marcus walked away from the restaurant, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. He felt like he was going home. Not to a place, but to a purpose, to a way of serving that honored both his past and his future. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Marcus Williams was ready to stop hiding from who he was and start embracing who he could become. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood in the main conference room of the newly opened Veterans Transition Medical Center, looking out at an audience of hospital staff, military personnel, and community leaders gathered for the program's official launch. He wore a simple navy blue suit rather than a uniform, but his bearing was unmistakably military as he prepared to address the crowd. Admiral Torres sat in the front row, having made the trip specifically for this ceremony. Beside her sat Dr. Chen, who had become one of the program's strongest advocates at the civilian hospital. In the back of the room, Marcus spotted several familiar faces from his own unit, including Gunnery Sergeant Torres, who had driven up from North Carolina for the event. But the person who meant the most to Marcus was sitting in the third row, Private Rodriguez, now Corporal Rodriguez, who had become the program's first success story and its most passionate supporter. Marcus stepped up to the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. The past 6 months had been transformative, not just for the program but for him personally. Working with other veterans, training civilian staff, and developing protocols had reminded him why he had loved military service in the first place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear. "6 months ago, I was working night shifts as a hospital medic, trying very hard to be invisible. I had convinced myself that my military service was behind me, that the best thing I could do was forget about that part of my life and focus on helping people in whatever small way I could." He paused, making eye contact with Admiral Torres, who nodded encouragingly. "What I didn't understand then was that my military service hadn't ended when I took off the uniform. It had simply changed form. Every veteran I helped in that emergency room, every time I used skills learned in combat to save lives in civilian hospitals, every moment I spent understanding what other veterans were going through, that was still service." The audience was quiet, attentive. Marcus could see nods of understanding from the veterans in the crowd. The Veterans Transition Medical Center exists because we finally recognized something important. The skills, experience, and perspective that veterans bring to civilian life aren't obstacles to overcome. They're assets to be utilized. The same qualities that make someone an effective soldier, sailor, Marine, or airman: dedication, courage, the ability to function under pressure, loyalty to their team. These are exactly the qualities our communities need. Marcus gestured toward the back of the room, where several program participants were standing. "Over the past 6 months, we've worked with 43 veterans ranging in age from 22 to 68. Some were struggling with physical injuries, others with psychological wounds, and many with both. But what they all had in common was a desire to continue serving, to find purpose and meaning in their civilian lives." He told the story of Sarah Martinez, a former Army medic who had been struggling with PTSD and unemployment. Through the program, she had been connected with training opportunities and was now working as a paramedic while pursuing a nursing degree. She had also become a peer counselor for other female veterans facing similar challenges. He spoke about James Patterson, a former Marine who had lost his left arm in an IED explosion and had been told he would never work in his chosen field of construction again. The program had connected him with adaptive technology and specialized training. He was now supervising construction projects and had started a nonprofit organization that hired disabled veterans. "These aren't just success stories," Marcus said. "They're reminders that when we invest in our veterans, when we help them transition their military skills to civilian applications, when we provide the support and resources they need to heal and grow, everyone benefits." Marcus paused and looked directly at Admiral Torres. 6 months ago, a Navy admiral reminded me that being a hero isn't something you do once and then retire from. It's a way of approaching life, a commitment to serving others that doesn't end when you take off the uniform. She helped me understand that the same courage that led me to run toward danger in Afghanistan could be applied to running toward the challenge of helping other veterans find their way home. The audience began to applaud, but Marcus held up a hand to continue. "But this program isn't just about helping veterans. It's about helping our entire community understand the value of military service and the unique perspective that veterans bring to civilian life. When we hire a veteran, we're not just giving someone a job. We're bringing in someone who understands teamwork, leadership, and mission accomplishment. When we include veterans in community planning, we're tapping into people who have experience solving complex problems under difficult conditions. Marcus moved away from the podium, speaking more conversationally now. I want to share something personal with you. For 10 years after leaving the military, I suffered from what I now recognize as severe survivor's guilt. I couldn't understand why I had survived combat when so many good people hadn't. I felt like I didn't deserve to be happy or successful because my friends were dead. The room was completely silent now. Everyone focused on Marcus's words. What I've learned through this program, through working with other veterans and seeing their journeys, is that survival isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to honor. We honor our fallen comrades not by diminishing ourselves, but by living full, meaningful lives that justify their sacrifice. We honor them by using our experiences to help others, by continuing to serve in whatever capacity we can. Marcus looked toward the back of the room, where Rodriguez was standing with several other young veterans. 3 nights ago, I received a call from a young Marine who was struggling with nightmares and panic attacks. Instead of trying to handle it alone the way I did for so many years, he reached out for help. He's starting therapy next week, and he's already connected with other veterans who understand what he's going through. That's the difference this program is making. Veterans are no longer suffering in silence. The applause began again, this time sustained and heartfelt. Marcus waited for it to die down before delivering his closing remarks. The Veterans Transition Medical Center is more than a healthcare facility. It's a bridge between military and civilian life, a place where the skills and experiences gained in service can be transformed into new forms of contribution. It's a reminder that once a veteran, always a veteran, and that's something to be proud of, not something to hide from. He straightened to attention one final time. To my fellow veterans, I want you to know that your service matters, your experience has value, and your community needs what you have to offer. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you that you're broken or damaged. You're not. You're warriors who have earned the right to come home and live with dignity and purpose. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Marcus to shake his hand, share their own stories, and ask questions about the program. But the moment that meant the most came when Admiral Torres approached him. "Hospital Corpsman Williams," she said formally, then smiled and added, "Director Williams, I should say. I'm proud of what you've accomplished here." "Thank you, Admiral," Marcus replied, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, and for reminding me that service comes in many forms." As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself standing in the center's main hallway, looking at the photos and stories of program participants that lined the walls. Each face represented a journey from struggle to purpose, from isolation to community, from surviving to thriving. Dr. Chen joined him, following his gaze to the wall of success stories. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I thought you were just a really good medic who kept to himself. I had no idea you were carrying all of this inside you." Marcus smiled. "Neither did I, really. It took someone else pointing it out for me to see it. And now?" Marcus considered the question. 6 months ago, he had been a man hiding from his past, working night shifts to avoid attention, convinced that his best days were behind him. Today, he was the director of a program that was changing lives, using his experiences to help others, and finally at peace with the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "Now I understand that the Marine who earned the Navy Cross and the medic who worked night shifts at the hospital are the same person," he said. "They always were. I just needed to learn how to integrate all the parts of my story into something whole." As Marcus locked up the center that night, he thought about the young Marine who would be starting therapy next week, about Sarah Martinez who was pursuing her nursing degree, about James Patterson who was building both construction projects and new lives for disabled veterans. He thought about all the people who were finding their way home just as he had. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Williams was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was still serving, still helping people, still making a difference. The only thing that had changed was that he was no longer hiding from the hero he had always been. Outside, the city slept peacefully, protected and served by people like Marcus Williams. Veterans who had answered the call to serve once and continued answering it every day, in ways both large and small for as long as they drew breath. The uniform might be different, the battlefield might have changed, but the mission remained the same. To serve others, to protect what matters, and to never leave anyone behind.